So, hello everyone, and welcome back to Indian Genes. It's been about a month since we've not put out a podcast, and I think that today, though, is an absolutely amazing reason to be back. And it actually forced me to get back on the podcast when I read this amazing story. They're right here in front of you, Shalin and Richa, medical students in Washington who've been working on a project that, for some reason, has been all over the news. And if you've not read it in scientific journals, newspapers, there have been a couple of interviews online. It's very interesting research. I think it's a paradigm shift. These two new young students have taken up a very big challenge, and I'm going to leave this to them to explain to you why exactly there's so much of buzz and a little bit more about them as well, where they come from, what they do. And I think it's going to be a great episode to anybody listening, especially students. And let me go back to Shalin and Richa. Why don't I leave you to talk to us a little bit more about where this all started for you?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. First off, thank you for having us. It's a huge honor to come on and be able to talk about this. This really started, a few years back. Both Richa and I, we were in our school's anatomy lab. So in our anatomy lab in medical school, this is where we dissect cadavers. But the more respectful term is donors. So a cadaver is a deceased human where we look at all their anatomy in order to study. So for all of these donors, they come in and we dissect them. So Richa and I and many other students that aren't here, but they contributed so much to this. We all dissected some donors in order to answer a question. And that question was, is there any kind of lymphatic connection to the central nervous system, right? So this kind of gets into the project as a whole, which, Richa, if you want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. So like Shalin said, we kind of all were in the anatomy lab. And the question, again, was, so there was sort of this discussion about truncal lymphatics. So the lymphatic system is basically the system of your body that deals with waste management almost of your body. So we have the blood and we have lymph. So lymph is like taking stuff from your body and dumping it later on back into the blood, but it's sort of like this like waste system of the body. So we always knew that there was a truncal lymphatic system, which is heavily studied, and we really have seen the lymph nodes and how it is associated with the immune system. So, which is again a very big part of your lymphatic system. But there was a disconnect between the lymphatic system of your peripheral kind of body or trunk, and then also of the brain. So for a long time, we thought that the brain was not part of this lymphatic system in your body. And that changed with the discovery of meningeal lymph and of glymphatic system, which is basically the lymphatic system in the brain. But there was no anatomical studies. And so when I say anatomical studies, it means that nobody had really dissected the human body to find those lymphatic vessels in the brain. And that is kind of where we come in, where we really wanted to kind of trace the root of the lymphatics within the brain and see how they entered the brain, exited the brain, and kind of to see what their broader role would be. So we started off with 9 cadaveric donors, and we used this peroxide and dye mixture that we injected into their thoracic duct, which is basically this like one of the main entry points into the lymphatic system. And we tried to trace the movement of this dye into the brain to see how these vessels were going into the brain. And we were able to find that upon dissection, that these lymphatic vessels that were going into the brain kind of traveled with the cranial nerves of the brain, and they exited with the can we take that out? With the cervical nerves of the brain. So we found that these lymphatic vessels traveled with the cervical nerves of the brain and exited in the intervertebral foramina of your cervical spine. And what that means is that the intervertebral foramina is basically, you have your spinal cord, and there's these like little gaps between your vertebral column that has the spinal nerves kind of coming out of it. So we found that the lymphatic vessels were actually exiting along with the spinal nerves at these points. And the way we did that was, after we found the dye kind of going up into your vessels, we dissected those vessels out and we stained them with something called D240 staining. And that's what stains parts of your lymphatic vessels. And so this was a really big revelation to us, because we were finally able to place like the anatomical presence of these vessels, and that kind of led to future hypotheses that we kind of built on. So the groundwork really was laid by this anatomical study where we found the presence of lymphatic vessels inside of the brain.
And I think one thing that I think your viewers might be able to use to help visualize is the study title is postmortem evidence of lymphatic vessels in the boundary of the central and peripheral nervous systems. So central nervous system is a fancy term for your brain and your spine, right? So it's your brain and your spine and the cavities that they're located. So your brain is in your skull, your spine is in your vertebral column, right? And they're encased in those bones. So that's your central nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system is where your entire nervous system is. That's not your brain and spine. So every time you have a nerve that's just like in your body that obviously connects to your spine and connects to your brain, those are peripheral nerves. But the I guess importance of this study is that if we consider central nervous system your quote unquote mind, and then your peripheral nervous system, your quote unquote body, then these vessels are located in between mind and body. So that's kind of like the take home, is that these are drainage vessels that are in between mind and body, your central and peripheral nervous systems. I hope that kind of makes sense.
Thank you for those details, Richa and Shalin as well, because as we move forward, I'm definitely going to go back into these details, and I think it's going to be very helpful that you guys have put a presentation up here. So I will be putting that up on the screen for the audience, and we can go in detail through what you just said. But before we get there, I just want to take one step back again and set the context here for maybe non-experts who are listening to us, and there are a lot of them as well. There may be the students who are very familiar with terminologies that you're using. So I'm just trying to balance this out. And if I'm getting this right, and you can please correct me, I just have a couple of questions at the moment. So why is this paper that you have put out picking up so much of news, and what makes it unique? I have gone through it. I do know that there is probably the first time you're getting into the area of consciousness scientifically through the brain, where we're talking about neurons and we're actions on neurons, and we're talking about probably fluids in the brain. I've just simplified it for my own self. And so far, we've always heard that it's the neurons that fire out the energy and all the action, and then everything else follows. Probably what you're saying is it's the fluid in the brain that starts everything. Now, this is very radical, and I'll use that word because it is very radical, and great that you guys are doing that. That's my first question, if this is aligned to what you are talking about. And the first part was, why do you think that people have been picking up on this paper and it's been all over the news?
So I think, as I was talking about before, is that the truncal lymph and the lymph inside of your brain the truncal lymph has always been studied. The lymph inside your brain has not been studied as widely because it is a very recent discovery on its own. So people have very recently found out that this lymphatic system also kind of stretches into your brain. And the reason that this study particularly is important is because we're, for the first time, showing the presence of these lymphatic vessels entering and exiting the brain. And the reason that that is important is, so your question to, the brain is, normally when we think of the brain, we think of neurons, how neurons fire, and how then we kind of get the downstream actions that our body does in response to those neurons firing. I think while we're maintaining that, we're not necessarily saying that the fluid in the brain is doing all of the work. We're saying that there's this secondary almost system that we haven't necessarily tapped into previously that is connected with the rest of our body. And just like the system that we're talking about affects the rest of our body, we can do things in the rest of our body that affect the system. And like a very quick example that I can think of for that is breathing, which we will talk about later on in our presentation, is because this is all fluid dynamics, changes in pressure in different compartments of your body are going to affect how the fluid moves within different compartments of your body. And so breathing, deep inhales, deep exhales are all going to be things that change your intrathoracic pressure and change the movement of these fluids from the brain into your truncal system. And so we're not necessarily saying that the neurons are not important. We're just saying that there's this secondary system of fluids that is also very connected with the rest of the body, so connecting the brain to the rest of the body, and is something that there needs to be a lot more study in, because while we're also saying this, there's so much that we feel like we are just like scratching the surface of. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
I want to add one thing too. I think philosophically, I think science is the scientific method and the scientific process, it is a fairly slow moving kind of thing. And the reason a lot of it is slow moving, there's a very good reason and a very healthy reason that it's slow moving, is because a lot of it is built on deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is how the scientific method operates, right? The thing that I guess I think part of what excitement and curiosity in science also is inductive reasoning, right? So it's essentially saying, if these vessels are part of the drainage, then what could be the possibility, right? What could be next? What could come next? And so it's a very, I don't know if risky is the right word, but it's probably a bit unconventional to, go about things in an inductive way. But inductive reasoning, in my opinion, is how hypotheses form, right? It's how the next step of science occurs. And I think it's also how you push fields forward. It's how you move, into saying, this is where the conversation should go from here. And even though we're extrapolating, even though, we're making giant leaps, for example, one of the leaps that, was made from these findings was a theory on consciousness, which we'll talk about as well. That's a huge leap, right? That's a huge leap to find some vessels in an anatomy lab and then say let's tie this to consciousness. There's no doubt about that's a huge leap, right? But that's what makes this exciting. That's what makes this cool. And I think that's what makes science so much fun, And so that's why I think that is, to go back to your question of why, maybe this is being picked up a lot. I think, at the end of the day, inductive reasoning is cool, and so that's why I think people have a lot to talk about when it comes to this.
Yes, I think because cross-functionally there's so much here, right? We will be getting into a little bit of philosophy, maybe psychology as well, because consciousness has to come in here, and we will come back to that part later. But let's get to the hard facts here of all the hard work that you have put in. And before we can get into the presentation, because this is your time to probably go through it, and then we can, for the second half, maybe we can talk about consequences. But let's drum down this idea first. I had one more question about you speaking about the lymphatic system vessels. Before you started this, did your research lead you to this, or did you have something in your mind and then you said, let's try to find the root? So how did this happen? Was this something that you guys thought would happen and said, okay, let's start researching, or while you were doing your research, this came up as a consequence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there was a really interesting paper that was released in January of 2024. I just remember the researcher's last name. I remember all these like studies just from like the last name, but it's a study called by Yoon et al. Yoon, and the study name is nasopharyngeal lymphatic plexus. I don't remember the exact name, but it was findings of a nasopharyngeal lymphatic plexus in mice. And that was kind of the study that started this whole kind of line of inquiry. It was essentially, a friend bringing this up. His name is Ethan. He brought it up, and he was essentially like, hey, look at this. And this was like a brain drain in rats, right? Like a whole like plexus of drainage that was described in rats. And really, like what it boils down to is that we were just in the right place at the right time. Like we were anatomy TAs in an anatomy lab, and this paper that had dropped in 2024 was essentially like, hey, look at this brain drain that's in rats, and kind of the line of inquiry, right, is like if you look at animal models and evolution, right, there's this idea that essentially like these structures that you find in mice and rats, like you should be able to find something similar in humans, because kind of the idea of like, okay, so this exists in mice, but it doesn't exist in humans, like that in of itself sounds kind of out there, right? Like, what do you mean it doesn't exist in human, but exists in mice? So that's where kind of the line of inquiry started, right? It was like, oh, I wonder if this is in mice, like, like, could this possibly be in humans? Could this be something that we could find? So yeah, that's kind of like where the initial starting of it all happened.
Interesting. Very interesting. So what I'll do is let me try to get the presentation going. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to mute myself and let you take us through this. And just let me know when you want to get to the next slide.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, this is our presentation. It's on neurofluid theory. So, that term neurofluid, it's kind of emerging. It essentially just describes the fluid flow in your brain. So, for the basic, the fundamental basic, right, is that the brain sits in a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. So that is called CSF for short. So CSF, right? And then there's other fluids as well, right? So there's blood. Blood goes to your brain and it gives it food, which is glucose, right? And then, blood also drains from there, right? And then this other fluid that we've been talking about is called lymph, and that's another fluid. So essentially, neurofluids is three things in general, right? So it's cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, it's blood, both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and then it's also lymph. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about neurofluid theory. And like I said earlier in the presentation, this is all like scholarly commentary. The information that we're providing is just for educational purposes, and it's for the love of science and curiosity. And it's not intended as any kind of medical advice. We're just hoping that by talking about it, like we can help not only move the field forward, but also, get other people who are interested in this emerging space, the encouragement to say like, hey, keep going, like keep researching this, keep looking into what this means, because who knows, right? So yeah, that's kind of our first slide. So yeah, let's go. Yeah.
So this is kind of the paper and the research that started everything. So this is our paper titled Postmortem Evidence of Lymphatic Vessels Located at the Boundary of Central and Peripheral Nervous System in the cervical spine. So as Shalin was talking about previously, the central and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves that are kind of coming out of the brain as well as the spinal cord. So we have the spinal nerves and then the cranial nerves, right? Now, our research focused on trying to find the anatomical derivatives of lymphatic vessels within the brain. So primitively, initially, there wasn't a lot of research about lymph and the presence of it inside of the brain. So one of the three fluids that we just spoke about, which includes the CSF, brain, and lymph. So the lymph is not something that was traditionally thought to exist inside of the brain. And that changed recently with the discovery of meningeal lymphatics and the presence of this third fluid within the brain. Our research focused on seeing if there is an anatomical connection between that third fluid that was inside of the brain, the lymph, and the lymph that was in the rest of our body, or the peripheral body. So what we did was we used, we used cadaveric donors, and we injected dye into their into a part of their lymphatic system, which is like sort of like an exit point of it. So that's the thoracic duct, and we waited for that dye to kind of climb up into the brain, which allowed us to then visualize grossly and dissect those vessels. And through that dissection, we confirmed that these were truly lymphatic vessels by staining them with a dye that's called D240, which stains specifically for lymphatic vessels. And we found that these vessels travel through the intervertebral foramina. So what that means is when you stack two vertebrae, one on top of the other, there is a little gap between both of them where these nerves that are part of the peripheral nervous system kind of branch off your spinal cord and exit. And so what we found was that these lymphatic vessels were actually exiting along with those spinal nerves in the cervical spine. And when I say cervical, that means that the spine that's closest to your brain. So this is, if you were to go back and feel the back of your neck, you would feel these like bumpy kind of bones there, and that's your cervical. Those are your cervical vertebrae. And so the little gaps between them would be the places that we found that these vessels were exiting from. And so that is what you see in the graphical abstract on the left side. It's kind of showing, so that the bundle that you're seeing is the nerve bundle, and the green spots that you're seeing around it are your lymphatic vessels. And so you can see that, of course, on the right side, you see the vertebra, where you see like one vertebra, and the little berry kind of looking thing in the center of it is your spinal cord, and you see how the peripheral nerve is sort of exiting from it on both sides. And so what it's showing you is kind of like a graphical or like an image illustration of what we found through our research. And that kind of led to what you're seeing on the right side, which is the cerebral lymph hypothesis. And this hypothesis is basically saying that, hey, there's this third fluid space that's present in the brain, which is possibly connected to the peripheral fluid space. And so one, how is that fluid in the lymphatic system in the brain being formed? And two, which was really, I would say, the most interesting part of this is, since it is fluid, it is dynamic, and it is going to be changed by the changes in your bodily pressures. And so question was like, is it really being affected by if your body has changes in its kind of physiologic state? And if it is, then how is that effect happening? And so there you can kind of see that, it's this like fountain model. At the top, you see the choroid plexus, and that is where CSF, which is the cerebrospinal fluid, which is one of the fluids of the body of the brain is formed. And it is kind of like bumping down these different like cups and draining into the end, which is the peripheral lymphatic circulation. So this is the model that we hypothesized, is that the CSF is basically what is being formed the choroid plexus. It is draining into your ventricles, and then part of it is draining into your meningeal lymphatic vessels, and then they're coming out through that intervertebral foramina in your cervical spine and then draining into your peripheral lymphatic circulation. Now, we have something that I want to make clear is that we haven't really injected the CSF. We haven't seen this flow exactly happen, which is why I keep referring to this as a hypothesis. So this is something that we've been actively working towards kind of proving and seeing if this is kind of what we think is the framework of the fluid movement inside of the brain. And we're trying to, one, prove it, and two, trying to understand how the different changes in your bodily physiological state affect this flow of fluid within your brain. And then we can go to the next slide, and Shalin is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so what that hypothesis, right? So when you're looking at that fountain, it's really important to state that that fountain is built off of inductive logic, right? So the logic of that fountain is essentially like, you know, like cup 1 goes to cup 2 goes to cup 3 goes to cup 4. And because we know these individual relationship exists, we put it all together into one big, essentially homeostatic brain drainage system, right? So what's really interesting is that when you look at cup 2 is called the glymphatic system. So cup 2 is really, really interesting in that it's emerging, right? So it's emerging in the field right now. And the scientist who discovered it, her name is Dr. Maiken Nedergaard. Her lab discovered it, I think back in like 2016, if I remember correctly. But it's really important to talk about what that cup is in particular. So if we could go to the next slide, I have a picture of that system. So when we talk about the glymphatic system, it's very important to define what that actually is, and then I can get to the actual theory that's written above it, right? But the glymphatic system is a system of fluid where the cerebrospinal fluid that is in the subarachnoid space, the subarachnoid space can be kind of envisioned as a layer that surrounds your brain, right? So it's almost like a layer of fluid that encompasses your entire brain, right? So it sits superficial to it, right? So that subarachnoid space is continuous with the perivascular space. So what do I mean by perivascular space? So your arteries and veins, these are vascular components that feed your brain and drain your brain, right? So perivascular, peri is the Latin stem for around. So the space of the glymphatic system is the space that is around your arteries and around your veins. So if you look at the diagram that's from the glymphatic system, implication for drugs for central nervous system diseases, if you look at that image, you can see a light blue space that surrounds both the artery and the vein. So the light blue space that's around the artery, that's your periarterial space, and the light blue space that's around your vein, that's your perivenous space, right? So both of these are perivascular, right? What the glymphatic system is that CSF that's from your subarachnoid space travels into these perivascular spaces and then travels through your brain, right? So your brain tissue is all these like gray cells that comprise of both like astrocytes and, your proper neurons. And then that CSF exits through your perivenous space, which is your efflux route, right? So that's how like that CSF exits, right? And then as you can see, like the vessels that Richa was talking about earlier, the meningeal lymphatic vessels, you can see like towards the right of that image, you can kind of see where that's coming from. So that's what your glymphatic system is, right? So right now in the literature, the glymphatic system is primarily characterized as like a waste drainage system, right? So it's where kind of like your brain gets almost like filtered, right? So it's these periarterial and perivenous spaces that drain, for example, waste that accumulates, such as amyloid. Amyloid is a protein that sometimes when it accumulates in your brain, it can lead to diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, right? So the idea is if there's a failure in the glymphatic system, it may relate to Alzheimer's neurodegeneration. It may be the root cause of that, right? So the theory that is I've kind of been talking about is called the GlymphoVasomotor Field theory. That's a mouthful, so I'm going to say GVF for short, right? Looking back, I don't know why I called it that, but I just call it GVF. So GVF, right, is a theory that actually ties consciousness into the glymphatic system. So when you read that title, GVF theory, a non-neuronal scaffolding for brain rhythms and consciousness, that term non-neuronal is doing a lot of work there, right? So what do I mean by non-neuronal? Non-neuronal in this particular instance, in the instance of the glymphatic system, is a term that is used for, for the fluid, right? So the fluid, it's non-neuronal is essentially the same thing as fluid in this, it's synonymous with fluid. So another way you could read GVF theory is GVF theory, a fluid scaffolding for brain rhythms and consciousness. So if we can go to the next slide, then that's where we talk more about GVF theory, right? So if you actually read the theory, there's a lot of inductive steps. There's many, like I think if I remember correctly, there's 10 inductive steps, and then the rest of the paper talks about pharmacological evaluation, what happens when you compare the existing models of consciousness. But something to take into account is that when we talk about consciousness, especially in Western neuroscience, Western neuroscience has a tendency, when you talk about consciousness, it's always built on, which neural pathways are responsible for consciousness, which neurons are responsible for, making sure that we're awake, that we're asleep. And that's kind of been what the past, I would say maybe 100 years has that's what the discussion has been about, right? So one thing that was really interesting, and again, like I said, this is inductive reasoning, but I came across this paper called Magnetic Fields Generated by Directed Ionic Flow. Now, this isn't a journal of physical chemistry, right? So this isn't even a biology journal, but it is a physical chemistry journal where, when you take a fluid that has ions in it, ions are just a fancy term for charged particles. So charged particles meaning positive charge and negative charge. When you take those ions and then you put them in a tube and when you put them in a tube and then make those ions flow, right, that generates a current, an electrical current. And so the electrical current has positive and negative charges, right? And so when that current is generated, then what you also get is a magnetic field, right? So this is really important because essentially we're taking this foundational physics concept and applying it to the glymphatic system, right? So this physics concept of ionic flow resembles the ionic flow that's seen in CSF. So CSF has ions in it. For example, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, right? It has all these different ions in it. And when you have structured ionic flow, if you have magnetic fields generated in a laboratory environment, then theoretically you should be having the same thing generated in directed ion flow that's biological, that's, just the periarterial spaces. And so then kind of the next question comes up of is this field real? Like, it should be real based off of the laws of physics. Like, it should be something that's actually happening. That's the first big question. Is this field real? That's kind of like where the theory kind of has the meat of it, right? The second thing that's really important is that we already know that neurons are able to be affected by weak electromagnetic fields. Now, how weak or how strong, like who knows? Like who knows at the end of the day? But the point being is that if this field is real, which the laws of physics say it should be real, does it affect neurons, in specific the synchronicity? Sorry, I'm mispronouncing that. But the synchronicity of neural firing, right? Like, are these ionic fields that are, electromagnetic fields that are being generated, are they potentially shaping how neurons are interacting, particularly the neurons that aren't connected to each other, right? So like you can see like these neurons are connected to each other in the diagram in the bottom right? But kind of the idea that's really interesting is that if you have neurons in this right-sided field and neurons in this left-sided field that you can't really see in the figure, like could they both be affected by the same electromagnetic field even though they're not technically correct? They're not technically connected. I don't know if that makes sense. But that's kind of like the central like question of it all. So that brings us to this, that brings us to this next really interesting article. So Rolf Kalvik, he writes a really, really interesting article. This was very recent, but he talks about the idea of GVF alone, which is just the orange arrow, right? He talks about that being a paradigm shift, right? And a paradigm shift, that's a really important term to use because there's a lot of, it's a very loaded term, but it's also like a term that I think is really important to unpack. So you can check out his article at Waves and Positions Substack, but I really want to highlight that term paradigm shift. If we can go to the next slide. So Thomas Kuhn, he writes from 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and you can see that he uses the term paradigm shift in number 5. So I encourage your readers to go check this out if this is something that interests them.
So as Shalin was saying, a paradigm shift is something as this kind of, the Kuhn cycle, as it kind of talks about almost this radical change in how we look at and interact with a particular idea that was preformed and that we've kind of known for a while. So if we can go back to the slide before this. So here we can see pre-science and then normal science. So I feel like the brain not having any lymphatic connection would be called pre-science in this situation. And then normal science would be, the recent discovery of meningeal lymphatic system. So we've recently found out that, the brain is actually, does actually have lymph in it, is connected to, or not connected to, sorry, I misspoke, does have lymph in it. The model drift and the model crisis and the model revolution is kind of like the process we're going through right now as we try to find the anatomical locations of the drainage points of these lymphatic vessels that through the anatomical study that we conducted. And through that, basically realizing that there's this third set of fluids within the brain that could affect how the brain functions, how the brain kind of recovers from stress, how the brain drains its toxins into the body. And then so by natural extension, how would kind of disruptions in the system affect your brain and the rest of your body? And so this process of almost, I don't want to say like reinventing the wheel, but kind of going through this, we've never really thought about it in this particular way is what I think Shalin is trying to explain as like this paradigm change. And it's almost, so when we start talking about things like, maybe this could explain consciousness, maybe this could explain why things like meditation are useful, or this could explain why maybe some people are more prone to neurodegenerative diseases than others. I feel like it comes into the territory of like, wait, this is moving too fast. This is too much too soon. And, we don't really know if this is really true. And I think the important thing to take from this sort of model of a paradigm change is to immerse yourself in it, to look for answers that we don't know yet. We don't have those answers yet. And the best way to do this is just through, like Shalin was talking about, inductive reasoning, and then hopefully bring deductive reasoning into it. Hopefully we are able to do studies and ask the right questions that lead us to the answers that we're kind of at this point just hoping that we find down the line.
Yeah, exactly. And if we could actually go back real quick to the previous slide. So the Kuhnian cycle, it talks about model shifts and model revolutions and different models for thinking. But the term that I really want to highlight is the term model. That's really another important term. So when we take both that cerebral lymph hypothesis that Richa was talking about, and we also take GVF, right, then the ultimate framework that builds on top of each other is what we're looking at, right? And it's that fountain with the orange arrow. So that is the theoretical model that's important in this whole kind of thing. It is a model that, again, remains theoretical, but it kind of, allows, at least what the hope is for scientists, clinicians, people interested in biology, whether it be human or animal, they can look at this model and really try and tear it apart, try and tear it apart in the sense of, is this model right? Is it wrong? Is parts of it right? Is parts of it wrong? At the end of the day, who knows? But that's the exciting part about science. That's the exciting part about looking at something like this and saying okay, let's see if this holds up. Let's see what aspects holds up. Let's see what aspects don't hold up. I think the quote from, Rolf's article really sums it up, right? This lesson really isn't about neuroscience. It's about how paradigm shifts actually work. They start with someone willing to draft up the frame before anyone has agreed that the frame is allowed. And so the data will catch up or it won't. Who knows, right? But at the end of the day, that's what science is. That's what the scientific method is. So if we can go to the next slide, actually. So one thing that was really interesting is, and this kind of stems from the idea of non-neuronal consciousness. Like we kind of talked about before, it's a fairly radical idea in Western neuroscience. And like I said, it's completely theoretical, and GVF provides this from inductive logic. One thing that was really interesting is that GVF, which was published, back in October, and the cerebral lymph hypothesis was published more recently, within the last, I think, month or two. What's really interesting is that when the discourse of it, I've been looking at the discourse, seeing what people have to say about it, both for cerebral lymph and GVF, which are both separate, papers, right? Both of them, people kind of hinted at the idea that potentially this could be pointing to something called chi, right? So one Russian outlet has an article as Chi, the energy, the basis of consciousness, and cerebral lymph hypothesis, interesting new theory pointing to Chi. So when I actually stumbled upon this, I do not claim to be any kind of expert in Chi. I don't know anything about Chi at all, but it did lead me down kind of a rabbit hole of what are people talking about when they're talking about Chi? And so one really interesting kind of correlation that I notice is that with, ideas of traditional medicine, global traditional medicine, right? They all point to these epistemologies of consciousness that are all based off of these ideas that, potentially this flowing life force or this flowing kind of sense of being is related to consciousness. And I found that deeply, deeply fascinating, right? So in Chinese culture, to my very rudimentary understanding, right, this idea is related to Qi, right? And so from these ideas comes these ideas of traditional practices. So traditional practices, and there's a table in this PowerPoint in a later slide. So we can get to that in a second. But the main takeaway that I want to get at is that these practices of global traditional medicine are aligned heavily with ideas of flow, and they may be related potentially to some of these ideas that we're seeing related to lymphatic drainage. So if we could go to the next slide.
Yeah, so before we kind of get into the integrative medicine aspect that Shalin was talking about, I think it is helpful to talk about prana, which is why I think this connection to, which is where I think this connection to Indian traditions becomes really, really interesting. In traditional India, in traditional Indian thought, prana was thought to be this life force or this vital force, which was associated with regulation of breath. Now, it wasn't itself breath, and it wasn't itself kind of, making claims of being anything that was draining the brain or anything like that. But there seemed to be some understanding associated with using breath to change the physiological state of your person, and that could mean consciousness, that could mean just mental state, that could mean just balance, and better memory, more emotional regulation. All of these things were kind of like bundled into this concept of prana, and then these chakras, which were sort of these like different centers along the body through which the energy could be organized and influenced. And so by consciously changing the breath, you could alter your internal state. And I think that this is where we're trying to be really careful. We're not theorizing that any of this, like we're not theorizing that these are anatomical organs that are making these changes happen, because that's not supported by science at the moment. We're also not saying that prana is CSF and that's what's happening in our body. Also not supported by science at the moment. What we are trying to say is that thousands of years ago, before we could measure brain activity, before we could really even understand how fluids were moving inside of the brain, there seemed to be this and I'm scared of calling it rudimentary, because we really don't know how deep this understanding ran. But there seemed to be this understanding of changing your breathing. And as I've referred to this multiple times when I was talking, is breathing is, it's really how you change your internal body pressures. Because when you take a deep breath in, your intrathoracic pressure, so that's the cavity of your lungs, it changes, and it is what allows you to do this breathing. And so there seemed to be an understanding before we could measure brain activity that this breathing could alter your brain's kind of mental state. It could make it more balanced. It could make it more homeostatic. And why this is interesting is because unlike your heart, your heart rate, breathing is something that you can control. So I could right now decide that I wanted to take the next breath I took was going to be a really deep one, or I could decide to take a really shallow breath. And so this seems to be this like physiological mechanism inside of our body that we have full control over. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth when we discuss like meditation and its effects on like our bodily regulation. But what is interesting is that there seems to be this link between a part of your body or a mechanism of your body that you can change on your own kind of accord, and then have those changes be perpetrated through the rest of your body, and especially through your brain. In terms of making it calmer, in terms of having a better regulation of it. And if you look at the practices that have kind of existed across the global, across the global traditions for centuries, so things like meditation, acupuncture, movement, music, all of these things, modern researchers are now kind of beginning to put together with like modern medicine, and being like, oh, well, these things actually positively affect a lot of aspects of our body according to modern scientific methods of screening and kind of visualizing these systems that we now have, like MRIs or immunohistochemistry. We didn't have this before, but we're now like, oh, wait, this actually, like meditation, for instance, actually is having very direct changes on dynamic flows inside of our body. And that is extremely I think it's extremely exciting, and it's a very amazing window into perhaps what people who came before us, our ancestors, knew in a lot of detail than we want to, give them credit for. I think it is very important that we really look back into that kind of knowledge that we already hold and have, and we are doing that, which is what I think is the best thing ever.
Yeah.
We're really kind of putting the modern technology that we have in terms of visualizing these different phases in our body, and kind of superimposing that with the previous knowledge that we have. And we are seeing that this actually does affect the body in a very positive way. And so Shalin is then going to talk about the integrative aspect of this research in the next slide.
Yeah, so what's really interesting, and yeah, this builds off of what Richa was saying, is that so there's already an idea that exists in like Western medicine, and underneath, the umbrella that is Western medicine, there is this thing called integrative medicine or mind-body medicine, right? And so what that seeks to do is take these practices of traditional wisdom that's cross-cultural, right? Like it's not just India, it's not just China. It's many indigenous practices, like across the world, whether that be indigenous, from North America to indigenous in Africa or wherever, right? But what's really fascinating, and it's obviously at the end of the day, like we're medical students, so we can't go about like doing scientific experiments on a framework and seeing, oh, does this really hold up or not? Because at the end of the day, like, we have to study for school and like, get our medical degree. But what we can do is take a framework and look at the correlatory power. Again, correlation, not causation, but correlatory power, and see what potentially lines up when it comes to practices of traditional wisdom and, like what these studies in integrative and mind-body medicine show, right? So I have this framework that I've been, talking about, but then also on the right, I have this table that compares practices of traditional medicine to integrative medicine, right? And so, for example, in traditional China, we can see, they have a practice called acupuncture, where they take needles and stick them into what they call meridians, right? Now, whether or not, meridians exist is kind of like a philosophically loaded thing to talk about, right? But what we can talk about is how acupuncture affects the body, right? And so what we see, these are all hyperlinked studies. So if your viewers like take these study titles and just Google them, they should pop up, right? But what we see, for example, is the use of acupuncture for addressing neurological and neuropsychiatric symptoms in patients with long COVID. And this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So this is a scientific method is what I'm getting at, right? There's also, studies out there for acupuncture and lymphedema. Lymphedema is when one of your limbs swells up really big because your limbs have an issue with drainage, right? So, when I'm looking at this table, what I'm seeing is like, oh, that's really interesting. The inductive logic sounds something like acupuncture affects cup 5, right? Like that's what the inductive logic could potentially represent. Meditation, there's a really incredible scientist in the States called, his name is Dr. David Vago, and he does research on how breathing practices, including, meditation, might affect the glymphatic system. So, the inductive line of thought is like, wow, like David Vago's work might show that meditation affects cup 2, right? So breathing practices, CSF flow, yogic breathing affecting cerebrospinal fluid dynamics during breathing practice, which Richa will talk about in a bit. That's about cup 1 and cup 2, right? Music and dance. This is one of my favorite ones because I love music so much. The effects and sound interventions on permeability of the blood-brain barrier and meningeal lymphatic clearance. So blood-brain barrier is a fancy term for cup 2. Meningeal lymphatic clearance is a term for cup 3, right? So we're looking at something, I would argue might be more ancient than any of these practices combined, right? So music and dance, that's been around, I think, probably the longest. And we're seeing that potentially that might affect the fluid flow of the brain. And so that I think is probably one of my favorite ones. And then we also have cup 5. So GALT is gut-associated lymphatic tissue. That's a lymphatic tissue that's associated with your gut. And so what we're seeing is that heritage diets, such as the Mediterranean diet, we're seeing that there's long-term neuroprotective effects in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And as I previously touched upon, like the glymphatic system and Alzheimer's disease are very well connected. So you have, 2 different kind of cups that are being aligned in the same framework. So that's why, this idea of integrated medicine and mind-body medicine, I think, is particularly fascinating. If we can go to the next slide.
So I think coming out of this broader discussion of sort of integrative medicine, one of the practices that I find truly interesting is that of focused attention style of meditation. And so in this paper, this is a 2025 paper that was published in PNAS, looking specifically at this type of meditation, so focused attention style of mindfulness meditation. And so in this, they kind of used a control group of people who hadn't meditated before, and they call these people meditation naive participants. And then there was a group of people who regularly meditated and did this kind of like a long focused attention style of meditation. So what they did was they used modern technology. So they used MRIs, 2 different types of them. So one of them was like a phase contrast MRI and another was a bold MRI. And they looked at the flow of CSF inside of these people's brains while they were meditating. And so when I say there, so I mentioned the control group, which was meditation naive participants. So this is a group of people who who hadn't really meditated before. And so their kind of practice of meditation in that study was very associated with just changing their breathing cycle. And what they found was people who had this kind of practice of having focused attention meditation, when they were meditating, the flow of CSF kind of reduced and stopped being regurgitant. So what I mean by regurgitant is basically flowing in the opposite direction that it needs to technically be flowing in. So flowing in the opposite direction is how best I would categorize it, right? And the reason why this is so important is because previously we've learned that when CSF flows regurgitantly, flows towards the brain instead of flowing away from it, it leads to downstream neurodegenerative changes, and it is associated with aging. And so it is extremely interesting to see that this kind of focused attention style of meditation was doing the opposite of that. So it was like almost draining the CSF in the right direction. It was preventing it from moving backwards the way that we don't want it to move, because that is kind of correlated to aging and neurodegenerative changes. And and we kind of found that in meditation naive subjects, just changing how they were breathing wasn't doing the same amount of good as this like focused attention style of mindful meditation was doing. So just changing how you just deep breaths was not doing the same in this study for CSF flow. But then if we move to the next few studies, if you could change the slide, please. Right. So now this yogic breathing and pulsatile CSF dynamics. So this kind of found that even in people who kind of weren't meditating regularly, weren't used to doing the long, focused kind of yogic form of meditation where I've heard things like, oh, you lose yourself in this like state of equilibrium with the space around you. Even without that, even when you were just doing pranayam, which is the way that you regulate your breathing through different kind of motions of taking deep breaths in, using one nostril, and kind of relaxing your body to a point of concentrative state, even that was really useful in kind of balancing that CSF flow, reducing that regurgitant flow, and making your brain calmer. Now, by saying all of this, are we saying that, oh, if you meditate, you're not going to get neurodegenerative diseases? No, we're not necessarily saying that. Or we're also not saying that, oh, if you meditate, your brain is going to drain all of the toxins. We're at this time also not saying that. What we are saying is that there seems to be a direct correlation between how you breathe, doing pranayama, doing meditation, and how that affects the flow of your CSF. Now, the downstream implications of that, the sort of inductive implications of that could be that, these practices could be protective from all of these neurodegenerative diseases that I just spoke about, or even a good form of like an anti-aging remedy almost. But that is something that is to come. That is something that is really interesting, and we hope to kind of dig a little deeper into it as time goes by.
If I could add one thing too, what's really interesting about this article is that the fact that when they're talking about the effects of yogic breathing on pulsatile cerebral spinal fluid dynamics, something that's important and very worth noting is that the GVF theory, it talks about electromagnetic fields that are generated due to that pulsatile nature of the glymphatic system and that glymphatic flow. That system is inherently pulsatile, right? It's not only like it's respiration, but it's also your cardiac pulsations. And so, the really exciting, again, inductive logic, I think, comes from the idea that pulsatile cerebrospinal fluid dynamics, if the GVF theory ends up being validated, then the really exciting implication is that yogic breathing could have an impact on the pulsatile cerebrospinal fluid dynamics and the ensuring potential electromagnetic fields that arise from those dynamics. So that's in particular what I think that's extremely exciting, is the idea that something as I don't want to say simple, but as something as something that we can do at home, right? Something that we can do at our own kind of what's the word for it? Something that we can do like
our own time or
exactly. Yeah, like something that we can do might be affecting our own consciousness. I think that kind of implication, there's something like really fascinating about that. So I just wanted to add that in.
And actually, to add a little bit more to what Shalin just said, so like you were saying with the GVF theory, right? So pulsatility is traditionally associated with the heart in our body because your heart is constantly beating. You're having like a rhythmic movement through your body of the blood, which is why we see the EKGs, which is why we see our blood, we feel a pulse. So there's that like rhythmic movement of a fluid through your body. And the GVF theory kind of stands on that rhythmicity, like you were saying. But what this study found was normally your GVF, like the electromagnetic fields within your brain, are heavily kind of affected by your heart and the pulsatile beating of your heart. But when you're doing these like deep breathing, abdominal breathing, using just one nostril, like when you're basically regulating your breath, it actually overtakes that. It starts becoming the kind of primary factor that is then affecting your, like respiration kind of goes above your heart rate, about in terms of like importance for what is affecting your like vascular clearance within the brain. And so by definition, your lymphatic flow of the brain. So there's clear, we can kind of make a clear connection between your breathing, especially when you're just not regularly, not when you're like not thinking about your breath and just breathing in and out, but when it's more controlled, we can make that association with clearance of our brain. And then if we can go to the next slide. So this is talking about neuromodulation, right? So this idea of self-directed neuromodulation, when we think about neuromodulation in medicine, we're usually thinking about doing something to the nervous system, like actively having like an intervention. So we could electrically stimulate parts of our brain. And one of the treatments for Parkinson's is that, like electrical stimulation of a part of your brain. We can stimulate. So I'm sure you guys have, in passing, maybe heard of the Valsalva maneuver. So this is when you're like for lack of better terms, straining when you're taking a poop. That's your Valsalva maneuver. You're
that's
just
the
like,
best way to put it, yeah.
You're taking a deep breath and you're like bearing down, right? That's your Valsalva maneuver. So things like that maneuver actually, I recently read that if you're really stressed and you do the Valsalva maneuver, you can calm down because it turns on your vagus nerve. And which makes sense, right? That's going to be your nerve that takes down the heart rate. It, kind of calms you down. So neuromodulation is kind of associated with all of these things. But what this paper kind of spoke about is pranayama, which is the ancient Indian traditional method of controlling your breath, controlling your kind of, as I was saying, like deep abdominal breaths, taking taking breath with one nostril, taking a huge deep breath, sometimes taking multiple shallow breaths in close succession. So all of these things are kind of, what this paper is finding is that they're kind of associated in engaging the brain in a very similar sort of way that we associate with neuromodulation and with targeted therapies like vagus nerve stimulation. So it's doing something almost similar to our brain. And I think this is where all three of the papers kind of come together. They're not saying the same thing necessarily, but what they're telling us that meditation, this act of controlling a physiological process within your body, is we're finding more and more that it's very directly having changes in how our brain, I almost want to say how our brain breathes, right? How it's sort of like flushing fluids out, how it is responding to changes in pressures. So it's almost like the mechanics of breathing are affecting the movement of fluid within the brain. And I think this is huge because as a person, as an Indian, I think something that we've spoken about this, something that I've always kind of had at the back of my mind as I was studying medicine, and the more I learn about it, is that there's simply so much in our texts that, like in our traditional historic texts, that kind of hints towards these different medical conditions that we study about, that I'm studying about now. And it's very interesting because maybe the people that came before us maybe just didn't have the words to say it exactly as we say it now, but there seems to be this like very strong understanding of how the body works and how different interventions, which are as simple as taking a few minutes to take really measured deep breaths. It is as simple as maybe picking up an instrument and getting comfortable with it. It is as simple as moving your body in dance. And I don't want to limit it to just Indian traditional methods because it's also as simple as acupuncture, right? So all of these things that people that came before us knew and did for such a long time seems to be something that we need to really start picking up. We really need to start studying these because the more we study it, the more we find that there is a very direct correlation between how these practices are changing the inner equilibrium of our body and how that is directly corresponding to a lot of positive effects in our body.
Yeah, and I think one thing too that's important is that when we look at these practices too, like I think there is something to be said about like, when we talk about scientists studying these practices, right? Like scientists studying like acupuncture, for example. And, there's something to be said about like when a scientist studies acupuncture and then, let's say theoretically validates it, right? Validates it as a positive thing. I think there's a kind of philosophical undertone of looking at a situation like this and being like, is it valid because science says it so, or was it valid the entire time? Was it valid to begin with? And so I think there's obviously at the end of the day, that's not like a question for me alone to answer, nor like any individual, right? But I think it is a discussion that probably is worth having, right? Like it's a discussion worth like talking about, like what does, there's this one philosopher, she writes really excellent book called Epistemic Injustice, right? And I encourage your readers or your listeners to go look at her work. But there is like kind of an underlying philosophical idea of like, what does, epistemic justice like look like in the world of like global traditional medicine? Obviously, like that's a very loaded question, and like I said, not a question for me alone to answer. But I do think it's an exciting question. I do think it's a question that, we shouldn't be afraid of. We shouldn't be, like cowering behind. I think if anything, it's how, paradigm shifts happen. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's like a great time, I think, in the science community to be alive right now, because we seem to have now all of like the technical tools that can help us take a peek inside of our body. And we already have this almost like thousands of years of work that other people have put in just without like a scientific term associated with it. Does that mean that we're saying that every single practice has like an associated underlying scientific meaning? Maybe, maybe not. We're not necessarily saying that directly, but I think it's exciting because we can now actually test those things, like putting people who are, meditating into an MRI machine. I mean, we couldn't have done that a long time ago, So seeing all of that now is just absolutely incredible. And I think there's such a long way to go ahead of this. And it's very, very exciting that so much is coming forth and so many people are like very actively interested in this and taking it a step forward every now and then. So it's great. I think it's a great time to be alive in science right now.
Wow. If I could stand up and applaud at the moment, I would do that. But I'm going to go out. I would go out of the screen, and absolutely amazing. I mean, I think that's it. I'm going to cut this podcast out right here, right now, and put it out there. I'm just joking, but I don't think I've heard a more inspirational story, and I'm just coming from it from a story point of view first. I'll get to your research as well, but I don't think I've heard a more inspirational story spoken to with the kind of passion, facts, and belief that two of you have just presented over the last 1 or 10 minutes. It's breathtaking. And I think that whatever this theory turns out to be, and wherever we go from here, what two of you have just shown all of us is, I think we're in safe hands as far as the new generation is concerned, and where you want to take this research. And coming from India myself, and both of you are from India as well, I'm even more excited because you're trying to bridge this gap. And at the beginning of this, I said paradigm shift, and for me that is the paradigm shift, because today you are boldly claiming that there is probably a connection between science and we're going to find this connection between, let's take ancient mythologies, ancient stories. I think that was the brave move for me when I first heard what you were trying to do. But I think after listening to you, anybody who's heard this episode is not going to be able to tell me that whatever you are doing is probably going to have a great outcome. So I just want to, first of all, congratulate you, because for me, I was just sitting back and listening and trying to keep up. And I'll be honest, I made a few notes, but at this age, it's a bit difficult for me to keep up midway with the research. I mean, I've got what you're trying to say. All our listeners are in the age group of 15 to 22, so I'm fine there. And what I just want to do is, if possible, in the second half, I just want to get back, because I made a few notes and maybe I need some clarification, and we can take it from there. If that is okay with you all, you're fine with this exchange that we could have?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, so I still think I have to get over this. You guys are absolutely amazing. I have to say that. And did you prepare for this, or you just came and spoke?
I think you just came and spoke. I prepared. I was kind of stressed.
Yeah, I think you'll. I mean, obviously, you'll have prepared through research, so that's not the issue. Because, as far as your research is concerned, you've been doing this day in and day out. But it's not really easy to just come online. And so let me tell you something. Besides doing what you are doing, you guys should also consider being science communicators. It would be amazing to start doing this on your own, where you're in control of this podcast on your own. You're speaking to people. You're putting out research. I think you guys would be great as a combination as well. But that's just as a side. I want to come back to your research.
It's really kind. Thank you. Yes.
Right. Now, I want to just check with. I want to get back to Richa. When you started speaking on that slide number 2, we were talking about fluid and the fact that this fluid is dynamic.
Mhm.
Right? There was initially we spoke about the lymphatic system vessels where this fluid is dynamic. Now, when we say that this particular fluid is dynamic and it has a physiological impact, with this dynamic fluid, if it is going to have a physiological impact on my body,
Right.
does the fluid have a physiological impact on my body, or does
Your body.
physiology of my body have an impact on the fluid?
Yeah, I would kind of say both. So to break it down, the lymphatic system, right, that we're talking about, one of the big things is that it's a waste management system of our body. So a lot of times, so if you kind of recollect this slide that Shalin was talking about, where he was kind of showing how this perivascular space around the artery moves fluid out through the brain into the perivascular space of the vein, and then that's kind of what forms the glymphatic system and the drainage point. So part of the job of the lymphatic system in any part of our body is to drain the toxins. So it's going to drain stuff that we don't want in our blood, and then funnily enough, it's going to kind of put it back into the blood later on at a later point. Okay. And the second thing is immune surveillance of our body. So the lymphatic system is I'm sure everybody's heard of like the lymph nodes of our body. So when you're sick and you go to the doctor, they're going to try to feel your submandibular lymph nodes and they'll be like, oh, well, these are swollen. That means that, you're a little sick. So they're kind of, lymph nodes are reactive to sickness, So in answering your question as to if the lymph is having an effect on the body or the body's physiology is having an effect on the lymph, I think when we're talking about the pulsatile movements of the lymph outside of the, pulsatility of the movements, the GVF, and movement out of the brain where it's draining the toxins, we think that the pulsatile movement is coming from the heart. So I hope my explanation of the lymphatic system is kind of allowing you to visualize it being very connected to our blood. So our blood vessels, especially our arteries, have that like deep pulsatile motion, which is as a result of where they're coming from, which is the heart. So when your heart pumps, there is the pulsatility is actually kind of carried through your body. And we think that that is what kind of drives some of this fluid out and allows for one, the production of CSF, then the production of the lymph. So there's like an associated pulsatility kind of continued through the system. And then also, how does it affect your body? Well, the lymph is carrying toxins out of your brain, right? It's kind of like the dumping site for stuff to get out of your brain. And then kind of pulling from what Shalin was talking about previously about like the amyloid proteins, about the tau proteins. So this, I want you to think of like toxins that the brain produces. These are just like misfolded proteins, sometimes just toxic waste that's coming out of the brain. And we're thinking that since the lymph is associated with dumping these toxins out, it's taking these toxins out as well. So why is that having a physiological impact, or why is that having an impact on your physiological bodily state? Well, because the presence or the accumulation of these amyloid and tau proteins is going to lead to neurodegenerative changes in the brain, lead to diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where the brain just starts degenerating because the excess presence of these proteins. And so to answer your question, I would say it's both. The lymph is having an effect on the body as well by being this like place where it's clearing out the toxic stuff from the brain. And then the body is also having an effect of producing that lymph because of the pulsatility of the heart. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
That does. I just wanted to clarify that. And before we get back into the GVF, now I think most of our listeners would have heard of either the integrated information theory or the global neural workspace theory. Mm-hmm. What is different with the GVF, like specifically? And I know we wouldn't want to get into the details of integrated information. I'm sure our listeners would. But what would you say is the one main difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what those two theories that are already put out there, those two theories are, how do I say this? They're neurocentric, right? So they're talking about specific like, for example, IIT like expects strong what they call within posterior integration, right? But G and WT expects long range frontosensory connectivity, right? So these are just fancier terms of saying like where quote unquote consciousness might be located, right? But the thing that's really, I think, kind of maybe fundamentally different about GVF compared to IIT and GNWT is that GVF kind of, I actually wouldn't say it disagrees with either of them, right? I think in a way it almost reconciles them. And it does this by introducing this idea of a global field modulation as just a different coupling routes, right? So in our brains, we have the specific blood flow network, and this blood flow network is called the circle of Willis, right? And so the idea is that when you have perivascular continuation, that essentially like the way that GVF has it structured is that it starts at the circle of Willis, right? But then it goes to your entire brain, right? Because your entire brain receives blood flow in this like kind of closed loop pattern, right? This like circular closed loop pattern, right? That kind of raises the idea of like, well, if these perivascular spaces are all continuous, right, then maybe the areas that IIT expects a strong, kind of signal of consciousness, and GNWT expects a different kind of area of consciousness, or I'm sorry, a different area of the brain to show consciousness, right? GVF kind of reconciles both by saying, hey, these perivascular spaces are continuous, right? So maybe these potential theoretical electromagnetic fields that are generated, potentially that explains, the idea of frontal visual synchronicity with the somewhat weaker intraposterior synchronicity, right? So this satisfies essentially both IIT and GNWT, right? So it's the idea of like maybe these two areas are connected, but they're not connected in a purely neuronal fashion, right? Like maybe it's not direct neuronal connectivity. Maybe it's connectivity based off of electromagnetism that's different in different areas of the brain, but not directly connected. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, and considering that you spoke about the magnetic fields, we can come back to that later.
Sure.
In your GVF model, we obviously start moving towards, and I want to get to the fluid part that we were speaking about, and then we are talking about a very close connection to consciousness. We also did speak about breathing and how that has an impact. So how central is the pineal gland to this? Because I seen it in the slide. To me, from what I'm hearing, this becomes very central to the whole GVF differentiator, as far as I was thinking, compared to either the integrated information theory or the global neuronal workspace. Because now you're getting, that's where I'm assuming a little bit of the magic is happening, if I could use that word. But what are your thoughts on this? How important is the pineal gland here? Where does this stand?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So the pineal gland is really interesting, right? In the sense that it's actually part of a larger group of, I guess, like parts in your brain, right? And this is called, so the pineal gland is what we call a circumventricular organ, right? So circum means around, and ventricular means the ventricles, right? So if we if you can just imagine in your mind that fountain, right? So cup one is the ventricular system, right? So the ventricular system is that, I like to say it's like this alien looking thing, right? And so the circumventricular organs, right, are at the border of these ventricles, right? So it's not just the pineal gland. There's many, right? So like there's the area postrema, there's the vascular organ of the lamina terminalis, right? And these are all things that you can look up, right? There's a fantastic Wikipedia page that I think like kind of describes them all, but the pineal gland is one of them, right? So what's really interesting about the circumventricular organs in particular is that these organs, they lack a blood-brain barrier. They're the only parts of your brain, to my understanding, that lack a blood-brain barrier. So the entirety of the rest of your brain, all the other neurons that are in your brain, they have this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which essentially separates, there's like almost like a filter, right, that is in between your blood and your brain. That's just a fancy term for a filter, I think. But these are organs in particular that do not have that blood-brain barrier. So what does that mean? That means they detect signals that are both in the CSF, right, and they detect signals that are in the blood, right? So in a really like fascinating kind of way, like these blood signals can almost be imagined as signals from your body, but these CSF signals are like signals that are happening within your central nervous system, right? Like they're the autonomic, the endocrine, like hormones that are existing within at the present moment, the brain, right? So taking that to the pineal gland, right? What's really interesting about the pineal gland is the pineal gland secretes melatonin, right? Melatonin is what we use to regulate our circadian rhythms, right? Our circadian rhythms are rhythms of sleep-wake, right? So when I feel sleepy, I have a lot of melatonin, and then I fall asleep. And then when I fall asleep, then my glymphatic system starts working, right? And then when my glymphatic system starts working, it starts clearing all my waste. And then, light hits our eyes in the morning, and then we wake up, and that's, how our body regulates our circadian rhythm. What's really interesting about the pineal gland is that within this network of brain drainage, and this framework of brain drainage, the pineal gland and melatonin may play a fundamental role in regulating that, right? Like a fundamental role in regulating how brain drainage occurs. And so, when we look at this, I guess, like fountain with an orange arrow, for lack of a better term, when we look at it, right, it's really easy to look at something like this and say, hey, is this brain drainage just plumbing? Is it just plumbing? It looks like plumbing, right? And I think this is where the discussion gets really interesting, or is it homeostatic? Right? Is it homeostatic? Does this drainage apparatus apply under homeostatic conditions? So what is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the idea, if you have, an AC, right? And the AC detects that it's too hot. Let's say 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius, but, let's say 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If the thermostat is set to 70 degrees, then the AC says, oh, I'm detecting that it's too hot. So it detects. That's the really important part. It detects, and then once it detects, it adjusts, right? So it starts cooling down to 70. And then once it hits 70, the thermostat and the AC system says, okay, I'm going to shut off now because I don't have to cool anymore. So it's that principle of homeostasis where what essentially we're saying is that maybe brain drainage is homeostatic, right? Maybe drainage is self-controlled. And so where it gets fundamentally interesting to me, I think, is when we're looking at brain drainage and we're looking at, the implications, the circadian rhythms and the circadian cycle may play a huge role in that sense of neurofluid homeostasis, right? And so that's where I think, to answer your question, I know I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but to bring it back to your question, I think what's particularly interesting is that the pineal gland, it's receiving blood flow and CSF flow. So it's receiving, regulation input from both the mind and the body. And, its effect on the circadian cycle may be regulating brain drainage itself.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just want to add, when Shalin talks about like sleep and associated drainage of the brain, I think something else that we're kind of in the process of, is it okay if I talk about the sleep? Sorry. Something that we're kind of in the process of theorizing is how, we kind of talked about how your like brain is draining all of these toxins out of your body, but there seems to be a relationship between the speed at which this happens, and it seems to be that when you're asleep, that draining of the toxins is happening at a much faster rate, or that kind of seems to be like a time where that drainage is happening. And so then kind of like connects the pineal gland just by transitivity. Your pineal gland is kind of controlling your sleep. So pineal gland is secreting melatonin, which is controlling your circadian rhythm, which is like a fancy way of saying that it's controlling when you sleep, when you feel sleepy, right? And so by doing that, and in part by being the circumventricular organ that kind of talks between the peripheral kind of like circulatory system and your cerebrospinal fluid content. So this can be like sensing pressures. It could be sensing concentrations of different ions, as sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. So all of these like different ions and the pressures associated with them could directly be affecting maybe our sleep cycle. And our sleep cycle, it could be affecting the almost like rate of clearance of toxins from our brain. So the pineal gland kind of does play a central role with that sort of circadian rhythm and the associated, drainage of the brain. I hope that helps.
Yeah. No, very clear. And I thought it was. Also, you touched on a little bit about pharmacology and healthcare. So I'm trying to see how this GVF talks to me, because the big impact I can see as far as healthcare is concerned, you mentioned, Shalin, about correlation and not causation.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain, and it's a good time because we just spoke about melatonin, and so there are certain symptoms that we have that are treated directly as symptoms and not the cause, right? So I do not need to continuously go to a doctor if I am stressed. I can speak to somebody. I would like to speak to somebody, and that de-stresses me. Now, we've tended to see that in the West, there is an immediate over-the-counter remedy. Now, does that remedy treat or go right down to what we're talking about here? Because we are also talking about different parts of the body, and we were just talking about the physiology and how it gets impacted. So I think we need to relook at this, right? Because if we are bringing in this ancient, or let's not call it ancient, but we were talking about breathing exercises, pranayama, like you just mentioned, maybe there are a lot of it that is now being done, and by default, people are realizing that I think I have a self-help switch within me. If I call these ancient technologies within the body. So what is your thought on that?
I think, and before you answer, I'd love to hear your answer to this as well. I think the distinction that I want to make from the get-go is that we're not proposing meditation or these integrative medicine practices to be the kind of end-all, be-all solution to very real medical conditions. So as medical students, we do appreciate the different ways in which your brain can have aberrant activity. It can I mean, stress is, of course, one of the big reasons, or but one of the big, as you said, one of the big symptoms of a lot of medical conditions. And these can be psychological conditions. These can be conditions of maybe backed up flow in the CSF. I think because this is such a nascent research, it is important to make that delineation a little early on, that we're not trying to remedy all that is wrong with the brain with integrative medicine practices. But what we are trying to say is there seems to be a lot of potential in kind of understanding what we can treat with integrative medicine practices, which is where we're at right now, is that we're seeing that these integrative medicine practices are helping to clear the CSF. The problem is, what does that exactly mean? What is that exactly going to prevent is something that we're still working on. So is it, the way I would kind of phrase this is that if I were to tell my parents, right? If they ask me, hey, if I meditate, does that mean I'm never gonna get Alzheimer's? I don't know. You know, I can't say for sure. But if I meditate, is that a bad thing? No, it is a very good thing, and you should do it. It's a good practice. Is it going to do you harm? No. Do we know for sure that it's going to do a lot of good, or do we know for sure it's going to do a lot of good in the exact terms that we define? Like, oh, I'm not going to get Alzheimer's. Not really, not yet. And I think that's where we're kind of operating right now, is trying to understand to what extent we can bring this information, and to what extent that this can really help us. And the clinical, clinical correlates of this research, I would say, is undeniably the most interesting part of medicine. But if you want to kind of like talk more about it,
sure.
I would want to say that, like, we're not saying that we can, like, pharmacotherapy is something that is entirely out of the question for a lot of brain conditions.
Yeah. I think, yeah. So to add on to that, I also think there's a really, like, when you look at the history of neuroscience and you look at, you know, where this could potentially lead, right? I used the term earlier, neurocentric, right? Like, in terms of how Western neuroscience has kind of treated the brain, right? It hasn't historically treated it as a hydraulic organ. And it's been very neurocentric, right? Understanding how the neurons work, understanding, you know, what neurotransmitters are, understanding what receptors are on neurotransmitters, and understanding how the blood-brain barrier works, right? What crosses the blood-brain barrier? Like, what drugs can cross the blood-brain barrier, what drugs can't, right? So this is really interesting, because there are consequences to this that I think probably aren't, like, discussed in the mainstream medicine, but I think it'll be something that comes up realistically, right? But you know, when you go to a physician for, you know, let's say a psychiatric medicine, right? That psychiatric medicine, I would say probably 9 out of 10 times, if not 10 out of 10, I just have to be safe, so I say 9 out of 10. But 9 out of 10 times, the drug that is being prescribed, the underlying mechanism for that is to alter the behavior of neurons, right? It's the altered behavior of some receptor on some neuron, right, to change neurotransmitter functionality, right? So, like, we're trying to, you know, increase, calcium in the, synaptic cleft, or or serotonin, or, norepinephrine. I'm just spitballing a bunch of names out right now, right? But it's like trying to change neurotransmitter concentrations in different places of the neuron, right? Like, that's what these drugs, for lack of a better term, like, that's what their targets are, right? So the thing that's really important is that when we're talking about moving away from neurocentricity, right, for lack of a better term, then we kind of have to go into this idea of rethinking what it means to cross the blood-brain barrier, right? So what I mean by that is, when most, like, central nervous pharmacology has been framed around the need for drugs to cross the blood-brain barrier and act directly on their neuronal targets, there's, what this framework proposes is that maybe that assumption is incomplete, right? for example, circumventricular organs, they lack the blood-brain barrier, right? So theoretically, and we know this, right? That's not theory. Like circumventricular organs, they lack a blood-brain barrier. And they, we also know connect to the hypothalamus, right? Which is kind of like your central, like endocrine regulatory, part of your brain. So there comes this really interesting question of like, maybe we don't need blood-brain barrier drugs to affect, let's say, potentially the circumventricular organs, right? But those are still part of your brain. Those are still completely a part of your brain. And among those, right, is the pineal gland, right? So it kind of has this interesting potential mechanistic idea of like maybe, if all of these systems that we're talking about, like the circumventricular organs, for example, in cup 1, the glymphatic system, that is essentially your blood-brain barrier itself, right? The cerebral vasculature, I would argue, isn't the blood-brain barrier, right? It's part of it, but it's not it. Exactly. The meningeal lymphatic vessels are probably independent of the blood-brain barrier, right? Yeah. And then, obviously your body's peripheral lymphatic circulation. So it kind of like this is the point I'm trying to nail home, is that when, there is a slow realization of like, maybe we can modulate, psychiatric conditions, neuronal conditions, even potentially by altering the drainage of the brain, maybe we might be able to rethink which drugs are worth pursuing research, right? Because right now, if you were to ask research scientists, I would argue that many of them say, oh, well, you can't use that drug. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, right? Does it matter, right? Does it matter, if it could potentially change the immune functionality of the overall fluid system that's occurring within your brain, right? Does it even matter at the end of the day? And so what really, there's a really interesting thing that was very recent. But there was I think some kind of news that was, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but there was some kind of news, I think, recently studied by Stanford. And it was something along the lines of that neutrophils, which is one of your body's immune cells, right, which travels through lymph. They use neutrophils to manufacture schizophrenia-linked protein. And this, it goes back to this larger idea that current treatments for a psychiatric condition like schizophrenia, they're palliatives, right? But maybe, there's potential in looking at how our immune system, functions to potentially treat the underlying, not underlying, that's maybe too far of a stretch, but there's potential in looking at your immune system that goes past, the best drug that we have for schizophrenia right now, right? Which is looking at the symptoms and saying, okay, well, these symptoms are caused by these neurons. So let's, for example, prescribe clozapine, right? But this is looking at the immune side of things and saying maybe potentially, there's a potential neutrophil brain connection, right? So that's related to schizophrenia. And again, this is all theorizing, right? I'm just putting theory out. But it's kind of saying these are the kinds of conversations I would argue that come up during quote unquote a paradigm shift, right? Is that saying well, maybe, clozapine has done a great job at reducing some of these symptoms that are coming up in schizophrenia, but maybe if we start looking at potential immune therapies, right? We may be able to address another aspect of schizophrenia. Who knows what that aspect is? I have no clue, right? I have no clue at all.
And I also think, like you said, because of the fact that this is just the beginning of what we are talking about, I think none of us can be sure, and none of us, but I mean, I'm in a different position, and as a commentator, I can speculate and I can speculate online, but you got to be careful what you say. You are medical students, and so I get that. Yeah. Now, what I also want to get back to is when again, I want to come back to pharmacology, and we were talking about the melatonin that is produced in the pineal gland. I was reading the study about DMT as well, and there are very small amounts of DMT that is produced in the pineal gland. However, that has not been verified. It's not been clarified. It did happen in some lab experiments with rats, but what I read was something to do with people that, and I'm going to just go a little bit to the left here, and you can pass this question or discussion at all. But when somebody comes to a near-death experience, there is a sudden rush of light and bright light, and you see your life in front. So speculation is that could be a sudden burst of melatonin, that could be a sudden burst of DMT, and that produces the high. Because today, psychedelic research into what we're talking about exactly is revealing a little bit more about mind-body connection, and exactly what we were saying, right? Because I want to just go a little bit into consciousness now. And where I'm trying to get to is, I don't know if you know about this Thomas Nagel famous paper in 1974, What Is It to Be a Bat? So he put this paper out, and he was trying to be subjectively say, what would you feel like, what is it like to be a bat? Now that paper in philosophy has been quoted ever since, and it's still running as a top paper. And then he went on to coin the term the hard problem of consciousness. And if you just get back to consciousness now, so that has always been, and today we all talk about the hard problem of consciousness. Now where I'm going with this is, we can start at the very beginning. If you think, or you all think, that consciousness is an emergent property, it emerges out of the brain, whether it could be the fluid, it could be neurons, or is the brain tapping into consciousness? And is there any comment or any stand you want to take on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know for sure that I don't know. I know that, right? Like I know for sure I don't know.
But you also know for sure that you are you.
That's true. Yeah, that is.
So you know.
So yeah, you know. Yeah, that's true.
Nobody else knows.
Yeah, right. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
I mean, when we're saying consciousness, in terms of like, do you tap into consciousness, or like, does the consciousness tap into you? I think it's, from what I understand, from everything that we've like spoken about, read, it feels like a very symbiotic relationship. It's not the chicken came before the egg, or it doesn't feel like that kind of a problem. It's more like one gives rise to another. Like, is there a soul that is kind of left behind after your physical body degenerates? Could be. We don't know that. And I feel like that is where this kind of becomes like a slightly scary conversation of like, oh, what exactly are we theorizing at this point? Like, are we trying to explain how life works? Which I feel like is a very far-fetched idea for the research that we're at this time capable of even kind of doing. So it's hard to give that answer. It's hard to say that, oh, you're conscious first and then you get a form, or you get a form first and then you get consciousness. I think what we can sort of say is this sort of like, there's like this synchronized relationship between you and your consciousness, because there's like, you're able to control it. You're able to control the way we can measure consciousness, I guess, in a sense, is you associate it with your brain, right? Like, you associate it with the activity of your brain, with how your brain is functioning, how your brain is working. That's how medically also we would define somebody as being conscious or unconscious, right? Like losing some brain activity, or gaining it, that kind of like a scientific definition of it. What we're trying to kind of perpetrate is that there seems to be a way that we can control it, by respiration, by all of these other integrative medicine ways and terms. And there seems to be this philosophical almost connection between what we do extrinsically and how it affects us intrinsically. So I would say, more than what comes first, I think the important takeaway would be that there seems to be a way in which we can like regulate it or affect it, at least.
Yeah, and you spoke earlier when you were talking about regulating breathing, and one part of what you also spoke about was music, and I know Shalin said he enjoys music. So we hear about something that's called the flow state, right? Everybody who's creative gets into this space where, whether it's a musician, it's a writer, I mean, you get into the space or you tap into some kind of energy that you think is giving you what you want. And yeah, that could be generated. It doesn't have to be out there. It can still be a state if you relax and you get into a proper mode for tapping into that energy. That's exactly what the flow state could be.
Yeah, I mean, and it could be like, I like to think about like pulsations, right? A lot of our discussion kind of revolves around pulsations of the heart and controlling our breathing, and that's also, I would say, a kind of like air is a fluid. It's kind of like a pulsation. So I am not as musically talented. I dance, and I think what I draw on when I'm doing that is a lot of like the beats of what I'm dancing to, right? So, and that is like a pulsatile almost sound, or a pulsatile flow of energy, like you mentioned. And so I think that is kind of similar to what happens when you're kind of regulating your breathing. There seems to be this sort of pulsatility that transcends your cardiac pulsatility and then is able to regulate your brain drainage. And you're right, I think it could be this sort of like you were saying, this like flow state, and maybe what is allowing us to reach that like state of relaxation or state of even concentration is that control over the pulsatility of like almost like the fields around us.
And I just want to step away from what we've just been speaking so far. And I seen that arrow on the top of the model that you spoke, and you were talking about an electromagnetic field.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you talk about a fluid, you come very close to getting into some form of like an electromagnetic field. We talk about plasma. We talk about the word field itself is very interesting because that touches into consciousness. And there is this concept of the Indra's net. I don't know if you've heard it. Indra's net. It's an Indian philosophy that there is this net of consciousness that permeates the whole universe at different points, at different pearls, and all of us are each one of it. And the reason I brought that out is because, like we said, there is a lot of meaning behind this, right? And we were talking about, again, you're talking about your whole theory is about probably the liquids in the brain, and the Indian mythology at the very beginning of time talks about the primordial ocean, right? Before time, where Vishnu was sleeping. And it was a sacred sound or vibration that started this cycle of time. And somehow when you went through that fountain, you started with the primordial ocean, right? We are talking about a liquid that was going down. And somewhere down there, you spoke about sound. And, well, I didn't look for it. It just came up here. But I don't want to dwell on it. And I just want to tell you that you guys are doing a great job by keeping both of these connected. And you've kept your head practical as well as what you can speak and talk about. So thank you for that. But this was my little bit of a diversion towards what I was thinking and trying to connect with. But tell me something now. What do you all do next with this theory, and how does it work? Because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of I hope that more people speak to you about this, because when I was listening to you, you were talking about, we spoke about, of course, what you're doing, but we touched on physics. We were talking about electromagnetism. We also spoke about biology. There was psychology. So this, to me, seems to be the beginning of a new stream. And if you can understand what I'm trying to say, right? So it's not linear. You cannot, in my mind, understand GVF if you're going to go from A to B, because this is not A to B. It looks like you need to go horizontally a little bit and then vertically again. So there is a lot here for two very young people as a challenge to take up. But do you all see it that way as well? Because I can't see a vertical movement here, because you have to take physics. You have to bring in physics at some part when you talk about an electromagnetic field. You have to talk about the quantum theory if you're going to be talking about mind, body, philosophy, psychology, and consciousness. But what do you see? How do you see the landscape, and what pieces are you trying to put together now that you'll have got such a strong, robust theory?
Yeah.
You've got to also make it work, and you've got to take it to the next step.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few aspects of that are challenging, right? And one is like just the constraints of being, like at the end of the day, we're medical students, right? So like the most important thing right now is for us to get our MDs, right? And then once we have our MDs, like then it's like, okay, we can talk about these theories as, physicians and people who are inquisitive with, a proper license and everything like that. But here's what I'll say, like philosophically, right? Is that, I remember this idea of a fountain was something that, I think might be like almost 2 years now, right? Like it's old. And so like one of the things that, I remember like throughout this entire process was remembering like, for me, my initial interest was in Alzheimer's, right? Like that was kind of my initial interest. And then I remember being like, oh, wow, maybe, multiple sclerosis has something to do with this. And then I remember being like, oh, well, maybe Parkinson's has something to do with this. And then, I'm sure Richa could say, like just seeing me go through this entire thing.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there. What about, would you also consider split personalities as anywhere here? Is there some space for that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So to be completely,
I'll tell you why I'm thinking about that, but I'll like to hear from you all first. The reason that came to me while I was listening to you and you spoke about Parkinson, that's quite the obvious one. But with this multiple personality disorder, I was thinking about this particular fluid that finally moves out and through the cerebral cortex around the brain, and then it's getting back to, wow, I'm trying to be a medical student in 2 hours. Then it gets back to the vertebrae, or did you say central nervous system? So far, so good?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Now, if ever, I don't know, this is a crazy one, is there a possible of some kind of a leak? And if there is a leak, can there be more than one leak that can lead to this multiple personality? And I'll tell you why I'm talking to you about this. Now, there is a very famous philosopher. His name is Bernardo Kastrup, and he's talks about analytical idealism. What he's talking about today is analytical idealism. He's a double PhD holder. He used to be in CERN, and he before that was a computer engineer. Now, his basis for this is that he talks about something that's called, within this whole consciousness or this field of consciousness, the word is disassociation. There are individual disassociations from this field that all of us are, right? So we are all dissociated from the field. That's why you all are one. And then at the end of it, you all go back to where it was, right? And where you've come from. But he connects the individual mind, the individual brain of every person to that of the universal mind as well. And tell me whether I'm totally going out of your scientific realm. But what I'm trying to get at is, within a person as well, what he has studied, and he's studied so many of them, he's done research, he's produced papers. These two split personalities don't know each other, get to know each other. I mean, the last I heard, there was somebody who had 16. And anyway, yeah. And there was another one that had two personalities, but could actually speak to each other, with each other. So it gets into different fields. But I'm just wondering whether I'm totally not on the right track with this, because this just came to my mind when I heard this.
No.
Because what you were talking about was when everything goes fine, right?
Yeah, sure.
But when everything does not go fine, what are the consequences? Alzheimer's, A, B, C, D. Do we? Is there space for that?
Yeah, that's okay. That's a really interesting question. So here's what I'll say about where I'm hearing you talking about this in it sounds like in a very like philosophical kind of way, like the philosophy of like dissociative kind of symptoms, right? So where I find this, I think, particularly interesting is that, and this literature is very, I wouldn't say this is well described by any means, right? But when you look at the framework that's presented, right, one of the fundamental characteristics of that framework, right, that I would think is inherent is what is characterizing, like, okay, what is the quality of the CSF? What is the quality of the lymph, right? Like, what is this isn't defined by any means, right? This is me saying, like, maybe it should be defined, right? Like, what is the immune quality? What is the CSF quality? And, what these definitions look like would not be up to me, right? It would be up to the field at the end of the day, right? But what's really interesting, right, is, there is literature that's already out there, right? I'm actually looking at correspondence in Nature Molecular Psychiatry right now, right? And the correspondence is the title of this correspondence, and this was published February 26, 2025, so very recent, right? And the title is Suspected Autoimmune Mediated Dissociative Symptoms, right? And so what it's a whole correspondence where they look at a case study, and a case study is just a fancy word for an individual who is probably experiencing this. What I find really I guess fascinating about their discussion and their conclusion is that they are saying that this case shows that dissociative symptoms may sometimes have an autoimmune cause or contribution, right? And so, like, in order to, I guess, like, kind of like determine this, like, you would have to have some kind of multimodal diagnostic workup. They're saying including a CSF analysis and screening for any potential novel anti-CNS antibodies that are existing within that CSF, right, in order to detect such cases. So, if we're looking at this and like applying that to the framework, where I think is particularly fascinating is that, like, if we were to kind of describe, like, okay, where things go wrong, right? One of those things is, like, what happens when the immune quality of CSF and lymph goes awry, right? Like, what happens when that goes bad, when there's a certain kind of almost like a way to scaffold what neuroinflammation looks like. Because right now, like, when you look at the literature, a lot of neuroinflammation, it's either very, very, very particular, right? Or it's like very broad, right? Like, you're just saying, oh, like, this is neuroinflammatory, right? But there's no, like, what I would argue, and Richa, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe this is maybe a wild claim, but what I am potentially thinking is that maybe neuroinflammation is not structured, right? It's not like something that's characterized by like a solid structure. And it's like characterized by very like particular observations, right? Like, oh, we see neuroinflammation in the choroid plexus, like, oh, we see neuroinflammation in the meningeal lymphatics, but neuroinflammation isn't characterized as an overall system, right? And so what I think is really interesting in the framework is that potentially neuroinflammation, that being structured, may relate to how that manifests in different disorders of consciousness. And by disorders of consciousness, I mean not just like, oh, oh, this person's unconscious, this person's in a coma, right? I mean a difference in like how that person is perceiving things that might be related to potential, psychiatric conditions. Because at the end of the day, something like, dissociation, like, you're perceiving reality, I would argue, maybe a bit differently than someone who isn't dissociating, right? And so I think that, like, if we're looking at like dissociative symptoms being related to an autoimmune like CSF, that I think could play a fundamental role in not only the drainage, but, the potential and obviously extremely theoretical generation of something like an electromagnetic field. I don't know if that makes sense.
And I think kind of like a continuation and also a response to the question that you had asked of like, now that we have this information, where does it go forward? And I feel like the way I visualize this kind of paper, this scientific knowledge that we're presenting is, it's kind of like, if you think of a network as like, I see it as like a center point. As in our conversation right now, you seem like you brought up the multiple personality disorder, or we discussed about Alzheimer's, we discussed about other neurodegenerative conditions. I think it just goes to show the kind of length and breadth of this topic, and which is kind of tying it back to this paradigm shift that we were talking about. The brain hasn't been looked at in this lens, I would say, ever, right? It's never been looked at as this organ that is like possibly heavily impacted by lymphatic drainage. So when we propose that idea, there's ought to be so much more to be discovered in, I would say, many disease processes that we currently know, because a lot of conditions that are psychological, that are even autoimmune, neurodegenerative, we don't really know why it's happening. We know what is happening. We know that there's this amyloid protein. We know that there's tau protein. There's like misfolding happening. But that is like almost, I want to say almost like a symptom of what's going on. We don't know why it's happening. We don't know the root cause of the reason of why this misfolding is happening. We don't know why it's not getting drained out. So when this theory is being proposed, I think it's a good jump off point for because there's so many. I mean, Shalin and I, again, we're just medical students. We are not experts in every field that this theory could possibly relate to. And I think it is a great starting point for people who are experts and who know so much more than we do about all of these like individual and separate fields that I think can be brought together like this. I think there is need for interdisciplinary collaboration between all of these fields of medicine to kind of, I don't want to say change entirely how they're visualizing a disease, but also take into consideration this theory of like how it could be impacting it, and kind of have this as a center point and have like these like networks jumping out of it. So that's how I feel like, and I would say you also are visualizing it pretty similarly.
Yeah, I think the biggest the one sentence takeaway is that I think oftentimes in medicine we like to put things into different boxes, right? We like to put things in different boxes, and I think where this theory yields the biggest potential, right, is people looking at it from different fields and saying like, all right, how might our fields interact in a way that is that we previously thought it was separate? Like that's really all it boils down to. And so it's like the immunologist and the neurologist and the
gastroenterologist,
right?
The gut-brain axis.
Yeah.
The cardiologists with the heart and the pulmonologists with the lung. Like there seems to be a connection with everything, and it's kind of ironic and very like, for the lack of better terms, just like interesting that the brain is at the center of all of this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I got when I was listening to you, and I still feel this is you guys are probably starting a stream of your own, and this will seep into so many other areas, and it's going to help so many people. But I know it's been a long time, and before we start winding down, or I let you go for your breakfast, lunch, or dinner, I don't know what the time is there what is the time?
It's like 12:30 p.m. It's noon.
PM.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I think we could. But one thing I definitely want to reassure you is you guys are fascinating in what you're doing. And this particular platform or this podcast platform, it's just there. It's owned by nobody. And I just like speaking to interesting people and putting it out there. So at any time, if you think you want to come back and speak to us, or you want to speak to each other, you have a platform. Whatever way I can do it, I'll facilitate it and get people to listen to you. I was just thinking maybe whenever you have the time, if you have the time, I'll try to connect with some of the medical students here in India, and if we could do a live session, if that's fine with you, and I'm sure they will have so many questions, and they're definitely going to have better questions than me. So we let them ask you their own questions, and we can have a fun interaction with what you guys are trying to say and with them. And I think it will just build up a little bit more of what you're talking about here, because I'm sure after listening to you, there are going to be a lot of people with a lot of questions, and especially medical students.
Sure.
And I have to say that before I hand over, one of the most underrated statements I've heard this year from Richa, just medical students. So you guys are much more than that, trust me, and you should be very proud of yourselves. But is there a place that, if I don't know if you want to give out some link, if people want to find your work, you want to point them to some email or some
Sure,
where can they find your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll be totally honest with you, right? Like that's in the plan right now to like have some kind of structured like infrastructure for all this. But this, to be totally honest with you, this like is one of those things where like it has been a process of realizing what this fountain could potentially mean, right? And it just like kind of came up as like a fun idea, right? And then like one thing led to another, and we're like, oh wow, like we're doing a podcast, so it's like kind of one of those like things. What I will say is right now, just because it's really only just because it's very easy to do right now, I've been putting a bunch of stuff on my Instagram, right? So if you look at my Instagram, it's Shalin _Bhatt, SHALIN _Bhatt, BHATT. Like I have a bunch of my research stuff that's already like on Instagram. In an ideal world, like that kind of shifts into like something more like disciplined, right? Into a more disciplined, way, like a more disciplined platform than just like an Instagram, right? But you can find stuff on there on my Instagram. I post about this like all the time, just for people that are interested.
Before I let you go, we'll start with Richa. There is, I'm sure. So I know Shalin just said music twice. So I guess, Shalin, in your free time, you listen to music, or that's how you relax, right?
Yeah.
So
I try. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you do, Richa? Is there something that?
I'm trained in Indian classical dance, but I am kind of embarrassed to say that I haven't been following up on that very much. I would say I read a bunch. I love watching movies. I bake a lot. Yeah. Time has been like a scarce commodity.
Yeah.
We haven't really been able to get a lot of time because we're doing our rotations right now. But yeah, when I do get time, I do all of those things. And if I get a longer amount of time, I go back home to India to see my parents. That's the best thing ever.
Okay. And Shalin, what instrument do you play, and how do you relax? What do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one, I could probably do better at relaxing more. But music's been a huge part of my life since I was a kid. I'm from Louisiana, and so when I was a kid, I was really into playing the trumpet. I would play in my schools band, but I got really into and also just because I think because Louisiana is so jazz heavy, right? It's a very jazz heavy state. Funny enough, sits up on the Mississippi River, if we're talking about flow. And I think realistically that was a huge influence for me. So I have my trumpet.
You really?
Yeah, it's right there. I have my trumpet. I don't play as much as I used to. I was really into it. Now,
next time you're going to open with that, like a piece of your own on the trumpet.
That's okay. That's okay. But one thing I have been trying is, and I'm not by any means good at it, but I've been trying to play jazz blues guitar. I find it very cathartic. I find being able to express yourself through music. It's very I don't know. It's it sounds so cheesy, but it works. And so I really like just, I wouldn't say I'm good at guitar at all. I am not, but I really like just picking up a guitar and messing around on it.
So you mentioned two instruments, trumpet and guitar, and you said you're not good at both. so I don't know what to make of it. But
I used to be really good at trumpet. I used to be. I'll give myself that.
okay, that is better. That is better.
I haven't picked it up in a long time.
Okay. And now everyone these days talks about these television serials, right?
Sure.
So you're following anything, Shalin, anything that interests you, where you can actually go through 13? Now, this is what I want to know. Can a medical student go through 14 episodes or 18 episodes? So just so that you know, Game of Thrones was 72 hours of content, 72 to 77. Now, can you imagine what you would have done in those 77 hours?
I haven't watched Game of Thrones.
I
know. I mean, I do watch series. I watch movies. I actually, so it's kind of bad because every time I'm eating food, I've gotten into this really bad habit of just watching something. And so like my lunches turn into like hour-long lunches because I'm just watching something and eating. I mean, you have to take a break. You have to relax. I feel like if I don't relax, it gets like I get a headache. It's better to just take a little bit of a break and then come back to it. And then, yeah, I watch stuff.
Yeah, I watched Game of Thrones. I like Game of Thrones.
You did?
Yeah, I did. I was a fan. I like Game of Thrones. There's this one show that I watched as a kid that I still kind of, I wouldn't say I necessarily watch it, but I do put it on the background. It's called Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm a huge fan of that show. I love that show. I think.
Wasn't there a movie as well?
Yeah, there was, but I didn't.
Wasn't it called Airbender? I'm trying to recollect. I think there was a movie. Anyway.
I think so, but I think there's a nostalgic aspect with this series, so I always just like having the series on sometimes.
What about Odyssey? Did you guys find time to watch that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was good.
It was really nice.
I enjoyed it.
Brilliant, yeah.
I'm waiting to watch the Spider-Man. I haven't had time to watch that, but
yeah, I haven't watched that either.
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
I'm like trying not to get spoilers, but yeah.
Yeah, I think my son has gone for it today. I'll have to figure out whether he's back and. He was trying to go for it before I got him to try to fix all my wires. So he gave me 5 minutes, like I said, and then he was out. So he'll come back and ask me how did it go. But anyway, it's been, I'm again looking at the clock. It's been 2 hours and 20 minutes. So like I said at the very beginning, you guys will start from excellent science communicators. You're very passionate about what you do. I'm sure everybody who listens to you is going to love listening to you. But more importantly, I just hope that your message gets through to a kid who's starting out their careers, planning their the course for their lives or what they want to study and do, and take inspiration from what you all are putting out there so confidently. So thank you for that. But we'll stay in touch if there's anything. Like I said, probably the next time will be a live session, but we can stay connected and see what we can do. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to both of you. And is there anything you want to say before we let you go for your 12:30 snack?
I mean, I would say it was a great honor to be here and
Agreed, yeah.
present our research. It's one thing to do research, and I think an entirely different thing to be able to get a platform to be able to talk about it. So thank you so much for having us. It was really nice, and I think you had really amazing questions to ask us, and I feel like a bunch of your questions also made us think a lot about. I think it's nice because when you talk about your research to people, they have questions, and your brain, you start thinking about what they're asking on those lines. So it's nice to have that exchange of ideas. It was so nice of you to kind of make this happen. So thank you so much for having us. It was really nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would add, maybe like a message for your viewers. Like you said, your viewers, what's the age range? 15 to 20?
12 to 23.
12 to 23. Okay. So I would tell your viewers that throughout life, you'll be presented with situations, circumstances where, like you can potentially like take a risk, right? Like you can take a risk and you don't know if it's a good idea or if it's a bad idea. But this is me saying, like, and obviously every situation is different, but you know, if your heart is telling you one thing and your mind is telling you, you know, that the passion is coming from a very like reasonable place, right? Then go for it. And just like go for it. You know, like you have, you know, obviously like when people say go for things, like I like to say, like, you know, maybe take it with a grain of salt, because there's certain things that people probably shouldn't go for in life, right? But in a situation where I think your mind and your heart are aligned, right? Like this is something that you're passionate about and it makes logical sense, you should go for it.
Thank you so much to both of you. I wish you all the best. Love and wishes to your families as well, your loved ones.
You as
Please
well.
pass that on from everyone here in India. And we're really proud to be speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.